Thank you very much, Laurel. And I will also want to begin by thanking Gina Evans, because Gina strongly suggested the importance of this topic. She introduced us to Dr. Rao, and she also inspires a lot of people because of her very brave, very beautiful journey of recovery. So thank you very much, Gina. It was Easter Vigil several years ago, and I baptized a little girl of 10 years old, and her single father was there, and in the course of the ceremony I called her a daughter of the light, and the dad was very moved by that, and I spoke with him after the ceremony and we connected. The very next day, Easter Sunday, he went on a motorcycle ride. He wasn't wearing a helmet. He had an accident that left him with catastrophic brain injury, changed his life completely on the spot. And just as tragically, his beautiful little girl lost her only parent. And no other event in my life brought to my attention that clearly the importance of protecting our brains, not just for ourselves, but for the people who depend on us. Protecting children from head injury is a very complex subject. It's not a black and white subject. And it's a very complex subject because the activities that make us vulnerable or make the children vulnerable to head injury are also extremely beneficial to them. The health benefits, the social benefits of sports for children are enormous. And there's something we don't spend enough time thinking about, is the benefits of risk. We're all descendants from major league risk takers. When the human beings first left Africa to colonize the world, they were major risk takers. The people who survived the Great Ice Age were major risk takers. The people who came to this country from Asia and from Europe and from all over the world, they were huge risk takers. All of us are descendants of risk takers. It's part of our genes. And we are rewarded for it. I found out a very interesting list of what psychologists consider the benefits of calculated risk. And it's a fascinating list. Unforeseen opportunities arrive. It builds confidence. It develops a sense of pride. You learn things that you would not otherwise. It gives you a chance to actively pursue success. It spurs creativity. And the last two are extremely important. It gives you an opportunity to create change in your life. It develops emotional resilience. When things go badly for you in life, if you have experienced risk, you will recover. Your resilience is greater. And finally, it makes you feel more engaged and happy. If you go mountain climbing as a hobby, or skiing, or if you go mountain biking, there are risks to all of these things. These people tend to have much greater, much better mental health. There is a doctor who is studying resilience, and he writes this, and I think it's fascinating. It's about protecting children from head injury. And his name is Dr. Unger, and he says this: there is a great danger that if we fail to provide our children the experiences they need to develop properly, we cheat them of what I call the risk-taker's advantage. If we overprotect our children, we cheat them. And then he goes even further. Odd as that may sound, there is a connection between the overprotection we offer our children and their subsequent violent behavior, experimentation with drugs, and risk-taking with their bodies and their minds and their emotions. In other words, you protect your child, you overprotect your child in one way, and the result is that the child is going to seek danger, and even a more self-destructive danger, in another way. There's been great studies that if we protect the children too much from taking risks in sports and otherwise, they tend to develop later in life anxiety disorders. So you have what you call an ethical dilemma. You have risks for children and you have benefits. So how do you guide them? That's what you call an ethical analysis, and that's where I'd like to begin. A few years ago, my nephews were teenagers. I have 4 nephews, and two from my sisters and 2 from my brother, and they came and at different times spent 2 weeks with me in Southern California. And I was horrified at the risk they were. I'm not a parent, so I said, my God, is that what parents go through? I mean, they were skateboarding and surfing and cycling, and it just, I'll never forget each time when I brought them back to the airport and they were in one piece, I said, thank you, thank you. I was exhausted. I was exhausted just looking at them and being terrified for them. My nephews belong to a culture where risk is entertaining. You can go on YouTube and you can research fails compilation, and you're going to see hours and hours and hours of basically the same pattern. You have some kind of a stunt that doesn't go well, a fall, big laughter from everybody else, and a poor guy or poor girl left with a head injury. That's part of our entertainment. People watch those accidents and those injuries as entertainment, as laughter. And that's part of the problem with our culture. Dr. Bennett Omalu, you may not have heard of his name, but he is made very famous by the movie Concussion. And he says this, Dr. Omalu says this, no child should be allowed to play hockey, football, or boxing. I disagree with that. With the exception of boxing, possibly, I think that is an extreme position. And what you do when you deprive children of those activities is that you deprive them also from the benefits that we were talking about. So the way to protect children basically is to mitigate the risk. And you mitigate the risk, not so much one child at a time, you mitigate the risk by changing a mentality. You're changing a culture. Those are difficult. It's difficult to change a culture of risk. It's difficult to change a culture of winning at all cost. By the way, I'm a huge believer that the winning at all cost mentality when children are involved is unacceptable. It's unethical. But it's difficult to change a culture when everybody is behind a winning at all cost mentality. And so you have a lot of pressures that come on people to keep the culture going. The consumers, the parents who are really competitive, the coaches who have pressures for their careers. There are a huge amount of pressures. But the definition of an ethical behavior is to resist pressure and do the right thing. When I was preparing for this talk tonight, I read a study that astonished me because I had no clue about it. But if you study the 3 groups that have a large role to play in protecting children from head injury, roughly speaking, healthcare professionals, athletic coaches, and parents, the group out of these 3 that is the most resistant to change and cooperation are parents. Our parents. There's a fascinating study conducted by Dr. McGowan in 2015 that clearly shows that parents are the most in denial when it comes to, is it safe to send a child back to play or not? And that same study found that healthcare professionals and athletic coaches were way ahead of parents when it came to protect children. And I don't know why that is. I would love the panel to tackle that because I'd like to understand the psychology of this. Coaches also have a huge role to play in this ethical dilemma. I am a guy who has enormous respect for coaches. Because coaches do a lot more than win games. Coaches mentor values. And without coaches, our children would grow up with a lot different values. Coaches have incredibly irreplaceable role in mentoring values. But sometimes changing a coach's style is important. I played rugby for years growing up, so I'm not unfamiliar with concussions. And I remember when I got my first one, and also had a little bit of a neck injury to add to it, and my coach was so upset that I was not going to play. And instead of saying, it's okay, get better, that's the most important thing, and we'll have you back when you're fine. Putting the pressure on the kid as if it was my fault at the time. So there's a big role to play for the coaches in changing the style of perceiving the games. I loved what I saw, Dr. I saw something that you were doing about girl soccer players. And I like that because what I read is that most of the literature is about boys. It's about guys. There is very, very little study that I could find on girls playing sports, and they're just as vulnerable to concussions as boys are. If you look now at the third group, the healthcare professionals, there is an MD, Dr. Matthew Kirchen, who has done a lot of thinking about the ethics of doctors and concussion. And what he found is that because there is privacy laws that are extremely important, so few people are in the loop when there is a very serious head injury, because you can't communicate the information to anybody else, just the parents, if the patient is a child. And what he found, it was interesting, we're talking, Dr. Patel and I, about the drive of college athletes. I mean, they're so driven that they are prepared to self-sacrifice sometimes, unless somebody stops them, so that they don't let down their teammates. And so there's a lot of what you call doctor shopping. So when one doctor says, no, I don't want you to go back in the field, then they go to the second one, no, I don't want to. Then the third one says, I think you're cool. And then you find what you're looking for, and then you go back playing and exposing yourself to much, much greater risk. But Dr. Kirchen, and I love the way he thinks about the medical ethics of concussion, he wrote this, and I find it fascinating. Doctors have an ethical duty to provide information on concussion risk factors and symptoms and possible neurological impairments in both the short and the long term. In other words, it's not enough for the doctor to provide a diagnosis. They need to inform that athlete or the parents of that child about future risks. Not just what's going to happen 2 weeks down the line, future risks. Symptoms developing much, much later in life. And the reason why doctors have such an important role to play in this is that there is another great study that is being done. If you have parents, coaches, and healthcare professionals, MD, nurse practitioners, scientists, all with the same message, people are going to listen to the scientist and ignore the other two. And so because scientists, MDs, and nurse practitioners, and people like Dr. Rao, Dr. Patel, are so trusted because they have so much credibility, they have an extra responsibility to take the time to be messengers, because they are, and by far, the most effective messengers. And Dr. Kirchen's idea is that you have to get more and more people into the loop. So what he recommends doctors to do is that when they have an athlete coming in or a child coming in with a concussion or a head injury, is to ask their permission to sign a waiver, so that the information that is going to be discovered in the course of the consultation can be shared with the school, with the university, with the coaches, with the parents if the athlete is old enough. He says the more upfront you are and the more people in the loop that you include, the more you minimize the problems down the line for an athlete. And this is important. We have to be honest with one another, because the two greatest ethical principles of protecting children, one is benevolence. We have to look after children. As Kevin Robinson told us, they don't have brains developed enough to understand the risk they are taking. I know, I've observed my nephews long enough. But also we have to be honest. We can't be in denial. The problem of our culture is that we're in major denials. Well, it's not that big of a deal. Yes, it can be a huge deal that affects their future. Now I want to talk a little bit about ethics, and how am I doing on time? I want to talk.
10 minutes.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about spirituality. How do you recover? And how do you use spirituality to recover? There is a fellow called Rick Leskovitz. He's an MD and he's director of integrative medicine in Boston, and he focuses exclusively on head injuries. And when he first started to study head injury patient, he heard his patients talk about the gift of TBI. So what does that mean, the gift of TBI? They just had a head injury or concussion. What does that mean, the gift of TBI? And he suddenly understood that you don't study or heal a brain like a damaged muscle. You heal a brain like a damaged person. And he wrote this: some people say that through TBI they developed a new perspective on their life and their place in the world. Let me give you an example, and it's a personal example. Dr. Rao mentioned in his statistics 11% of TBI in this country are as a result of assaults. I'm one of those guys. I worked, as some of you know, in the restaurant business in Los Angeles for years, and I knew it was dangerous for me to leave late at night with a briefcase, night after night on my own. I knew it. And then one time I was attacked for my briefcase about 10 years ago in a dark parking lot, and I had a major concussion. I was beaten, I was kicked. You'd think taking the bag would be enough, but apparently not. And it changed me. It changed me. And it didn't change me of me being more afraid of people. It didn't change me from now on I'm going to carry a gun. The way it changed me is my perception of reality changed. And I was always a spiritual person, but I became after that a much more contemplative person. It changed me. Dr. Laura Bruno says this. She says, I do recognize higher than average interest in spiritual growth and intuitive awareness in people whose brains have been short-circuited. In other words, with people who have had brain injury, this Dr. Bruno says, I have observed a lot more than average interest in spiritual things. I thought about history and the spiritual giants of history. St. Paul, the tireless apostle, famously fell from his horse on the road to Damascus. St. Romuald, incredibly influential because he brought the spiritual tradition of the West and the East, and he married them, he blended them. He fell from his horse. The man who changed the concept of spiritual discernment, St. Ignatius, was injured in battle. Hildegard von Bingen, the brilliant genius of music and a mystic, she had a terrible fall. And the astonishingly brilliant Dostoevsky, the great Russian writer, had a terrible fall and suffered from seizures all his life. And so the first thing that they do in that center in Boston is that they teach people what they call calm awareness. And this is how the Dr. Leskovitz describes it. We teach mindfulness and meditation, which with practice helps people learn to be present and aware of their thoughts, feelings, emotions, and sensations. And people learn that by paying attention to their breathing, they can calm down their minds, and from there they can find a place to know that they have a choice to let judgments go and to respond rather than react. In other words, I teach people meditation because I remove chaos from their minds and I replace it with serenity and calm. And he said 60% of my patients, because of this practice, recover from depression, and 60% of my patients I'm able to lead to recovery without drug therapy. There's a lady called Monica Carlos, and she wrote an incredibly moving account of her husband. Her husband was an NHL star, and he had so many concussions that it ended his career and changed him, became very disabled as a result of the concussions. And she writes this stunningly moving account about his transformation, where from a bitter man, terribly angry at NHL, just feeling taken advantage of, I mean, they just used me the moment I couldn't play, I was out, and to somebody who became a seeker, not just a victim, a seeker. And she described how he became little by little incredibly sympathetic to people's suffering, and incredibly intuitive, and incredibly kind and spiritual and contemplative, and experienced a recovery that was way beyond their expectation when his search began. One of the things that victims of head injury have noticed is that they become more intuitive. Something changes in them that makes them more intuitive. And Dr. Leskovitz described it like this: like a blind person whose other senses become more acute, a person with TBI often develops a deeper intuition, a keener awareness about the world and the people around them. And I think that is absolutely, entirely true. I also don't want to go on too much, I'm almost finished. Talked about prayer a little bit. There is a Baptist chaplain at Camp Pendleton in California who works with Marines coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, all of whom had head injuries. And what he does with them is that he teaches them prayer. And this is what he observed. He said, I have noticed that the more quiet time an injured Marine spends meditating and praying, the more in tune he or she become with their recovery. And he says it's dramatic, the difference that it has made. Whether they were religious or not before, it doesn't make any difference. The difference that it has made in their recovery, I think, is absolutely stunning. And he describes prayer in this way. He said, prayer is the ability to calm yourself long enough to hear the voice of God, or for those Marines that are not religious, to hear the voice of wisdom inside of you. Sometimes we think of prayer as trying to change the mind of God. Please change your mind. Good luck with that, by the way. Doesn't work very well. Prayer is not about changing the mind of God. Prayer is about changing you. It's about changing you to accept the mind of God. That's what prayer is. So prayer is about self-transformation. Prayer is about personal change. And the way you achieve that is by learning through prayer to let go in what prevents you from changing. In conclusion, I want to quote a passage from the New Testament. It's often attributed to Jesus, but it's not by him, it's by John. It says this, and it's beautiful. It says, perfect love casts out fear. Perfect love throws fear away. And you say, well, what does it mean? Try it sometime. Try it sometimes when you're going through a period of great fear or anxiety or concern. You're so worried and you just can't shake it out. Try to focus on compassion. Try to focus on loving people around you, just for that moment. It is impossible to love and to fear at the same time. It's impossible. So John was right. Love casts out all fears. But there's another reason why it's important, is that love or compassion, that's how you change a culture. You change the mentality that is harmful to children. You change the culture that is potentially harmful to children by caring more about them that you care about the rewards you personally receive from that culture and that mentality. And so we change the culture one by one, and it takes all of us. It's a job for all of us, and it begins the moment we start caring more about one another than about the rewards we get from one another. Thank you very much.